Have you ever noticed how certain people drain the life out of you? How after spending time with them, you feel exhausted, confused, or somehow lesser than you were before? Carl Jung, one of the most brilliant minds in psychology, understood something profound about human relationships that most of us overlook. He knew that the people we surround ourselves with don't just influence our mood or our day, they shape our very identity, our psychological growth, and our ability to become who we're truly meant to be. Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But what he didn't say explicitly, though his work makes abundantly clear, is that not all transformations are beneficial. Some are toxic, some are destructive, and some relationships don't just fail to help us grow. They actively prevent our individuation, which is Jung's term for becoming our authentic self. Today, we're going to explore 5 specific types of people that Jung's psychological framework suggests we must remove from our lives if we want to achieve psychological wholeness and live authentically. This isn't about being cruel or cold-hearted. It's about recognizing that your psychological health, your growth, and your journey towards self-actualization are too important to sacrifice for relationships that diminish you. The first type of person you must remove from your life is what I call the shadow projector. And understanding this requires grasping one of Jung's most important concepts, the shadow. Jung believed that within each of us exists a shadow, the repository of all the traits, impulses, and aspects of ourselves that we've repressed, denied, or rejected. These aren't necessarily evil things. They're simply the parts of ourselves we've learned are unacceptable. Maybe you were taught that anger is bad, so your capacity for righteous anger lives in your shadow. Maybe you learned that ambition is selfish, so your drive lives there. The shadow contains both our repressed darkness and our unlived potential. Now, here's where it gets psychologically dangerous. When we haven't done the work to integrate our own shadow, we unconsciously project it onto others. We see in other people the very things we can't acknowledge in ourselves. Jung wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The shadow projector is someone who hasn't learned this lesson. The shadow projector constantly accuses you of the very things they're guilty of. If they're dishonest, they'll constantly question your integrity. If they're manipulative, they'll accuse you of trying to control them. If they harbor secret resentments, they'll insist you're the one who's hostile. This isn't mere hypocrisy. It's an unconscious psychological defense mechanism. They literally cannot see these qualities in themselves, so they must see them in you. What makes shadow projectors so dangerous is that they can make you doubt your own reality. Imagine you're a genuinely kind person, but someone constantly accuses you of being cruel. Over time, you might start questioning yourself. Am I cruel? Maybe I am and don't realize it. This is called gaslighting in modern terms, but Jung understood the psychological mechanism behind it decades earlier. The shadow projector forces you to carry their psychological baggage, and this prevents both of you from growing. Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires integrating your shadow, not projecting it. When you're surrounded by shadow projectors, you can't do this work. You're too busy defending yourself against false accusations or absorbing their projected content. You become a screen for their psychological movie rather than the author of your own story. How do you identify a shadow projector? Listen for patterns. They consistently attribute to you motives, feelings, or characteristics that don't match your actions or self-understanding. They refuse to take responsibility for their own flaws while being hypervigilant about yours, especially flaws that mirror their own. When you point out their behavior, they deflect and turn it back on you. The conversation never moves forward. It loops endlessly. The reason you must remove shadow projectors from your life is simple. You cannot individuate while serving as someone else's projection screen. Jung's entire therapeutic approach was built on making the unconscious conscious, on integrating what we've repressed. The shadow projector actively prevents this by demanding you remain unconscious to serve their psychological needs. This doesn't mean you abandon everyone who occasionally projects. We all do this sometimes. But chronic shadow projectors, who make projection their primary mode of relating, will keep you trapped in their psychological prison. Your liberation requires their absence. The second type of person you must remove is what I call the persona enforcer, and this relates to another of Jung's crucial concepts. The persona. Jung described the persona as the mask we wear in social situations, the public face we present to the world. The word comes from the Latin term for the masks worn by actors in Greek theater. Your persona might be the competent professional, the caring friend, the strong provider, or the free spirit. Personas aren't inherently bad. They're necessary for navigating society. The problem arises when we become identified with our persona, mistaking the mask for our true self. The persona enforcer is someone who has a rigid idea of who you should be and relentlessly pressures you to conform to that image. They've decided you're the responsible one, or the funny one, or the one who doesn't need help, and any deviation from this script threatens them. Why? Because your persona stability helps maintain their worldview and, often, their own persona. Let me give you an example. Imagine you've always been the strong, stoic friend who gives advice but never needs it. That's your persona in the relationship, but you're going through something genuinely difficult and need support. When you reach out, the persona enforcer responds with surprise, discomfort, or even anger. This isn't like you. You need to pull yourself together. They're not responding to your actual needs. They're responding to the disruption of the persona they've assigned you. Jung warned that over-identification with the persona leads to psychological inflation or deflation. You either become grandiose, believing you really are the mask, or you feel fraudulent and empty, knowing you're living a lie. The persona enforcer accelerates this problem by actively punishing you when you try to be authentic. These people reveal themselves through their discomfort with your growth or change. If you've been the party person and you decide you want quieter, more meaningful connections, they'll mock your evolution. What happened to you? You've gotten so boring. If you've been the weak one and you develop confidence, they'll undermine it. Don't get too full of yourself. They need you to stay in your assigned role because it stabilizes their psychological ecosystem. What makes persona enforcers particularly insidious is that they often frame their enforcement as concern or love. I'm just worried about you. You're not acting like yourself. But yourself, in this context, means the version of you that I need you to be. They conflate your persona with your identity and resist your individuation because it disrupts their sense of order. Jung believed that true psychological development requires loosening our identification with the persona while still being able to use it when appropriate. It's about knowing the difference between who you are and the role you're playing. The persona enforcer makes this impossible because they punish authenticity and reward conformity to the mask. In the individuation process, you must encounter and integrate parts of yourself that lie beneath the persona. Your shadow, yes, but also your anima or animus, the contrasexual aspects of your psyche, your complexes, and ultimately yourself with a capital S, the center of the psyche that represents wholeness. None of this work can happen if you're constantly being policed into maintaining a false persona. You know you're dealing with a persona enforcer when your personal growth is met with resistance, when your vulnerability is dismissed as weakness or not really you, when your attempts to explore different aspects of yourself are ridiculed or pathologized. These people don't want you to become who you truly are. They want you to remain who they need you to be. Removing persona enforcers from your life is an act of self-respect. It's a declaration that your authentic development matters more than someone else's comfort with your assigned role. Jung knew that individuation often requires separating from collective expectations, and the persona enforcer is the embodiment of those expectations in human form. The third type requires understanding two of Jung's most complex and often misunderstood concepts, the anima and animus. These are the contrasexual archetypes within the psyche. The anima is the feminine aspect in men, while the animus is the masculine aspect in women. Now, before we go further, understand that Jung was writing in the early 20th century, and his understanding of gender was limited by his time. The principles, however, remain psychologically valuable when we understand them symbolically rather than literally. The anima and animus represent the qualities, attitudes, and ways of being that we've been culturally conditioned to repress because they don't align with our gender role. For a man socialized to be tough, his anima might carry his capacity for tenderness, intuition, and emotional receptivity. For a woman socialized to be accommodating, her animus might carry her capacity for assertion, logic, and independence. When these archetypes remain unconscious, we project them. Men project their anima onto women, seeing in them an idealized feminine perfection or, negatively, irrational emotionality. Women project their animus onto men, seeing idealized masculine strength or, negatively, crude aggression. Jung believed that psychological maturity requires withdrawing these projections and integrating these aspects within ourselves. The anima or animus possessor is someone who has become identified with your projection rather than being a real person. This happens in relationships where there's intense, irrational attraction or repulsion, what we might call chemistry, in romantic contexts, but which Jung understood as projection. Here's how this manifests dangerously. You meet someone who seems to embody everything you're not, perhaps everything you secretly long to be. If you're overly rational, they seem wonderfully spontaneous and emotional. If you're too passive, they seem powerfully assertive. This isn't love or even genuine connection. It's your psyche recognizing its missing parts in another person. Jung called this falling in love with your own unconscious. The relationship becomes addictive because you're not actually connecting with a real human being. You're connecting with your own psychic content, reflected back at you. When the projection eventually fails, and it always does because real people can't sustain being your psychic screen, the disillusionment is devastating. But there's another, more toxic version of the anima/animus possessor. This is someone who deliberately cultivates your projection because it gives them power. They learn what you're unconsciously seeking and perform it, becoming the living embodiment of your unlived potential. Cult leaders do this. Manipulative, romantic partners do this. Certain charismatic figures do this. Jung observed that when we're possessed by the anima or animus, we become moody, irrational, and prone to emotional storms. A man possessed by his anima becomes petulant and oversensitive. A woman possessed by her animus becomes rigid and opinionated. The anima/animus possessor keeps you in this state of possession because maintaining your projection serves their needs. You can identify this type through the intensity and irrationality of your emotional response to them. You might feel you can't live without them, despite barely knowing them. You might attribute to them quasi-magical qualities. They're uniquely wise, uniquely powerful, uniquely capable of understanding you. You might find yourself behaving uncharacteristically in their presence, as though you're not quite yourself. The danger here is profound. As long as you're projecting your anima or animus onto someone else, you cannot integrate those qualities within yourself. A man who projects all his emotional depth onto women cannot develop his own emotional life. A woman who projects all her power onto men cannot claim her own authority. The anima/animus possessor keeps you psychologically incomplete by serving as the container for the parts of yourself you most need to reclaim. Jung's concept of individuation requires that we withdraw these projections and recognize that what we saw out there is actually in here, within our own psyche. The qualities we attributed to the other person are actually our own undeveloped potentials calling for integration. Removing the anima/animus possessor from your life might feel like psychological death. The relationship is often intensely addictive precisely because it's touching on such deep, unconscious material. But this removal is necessary for the integration work to begin. Only when you stop seeking your wholeness in another person can you begin the work of becoming whole within yourself. This is perhaps one of Jung's most challenging teachings. The very people we're most magnetically drawn to are often the ones we most need to separate from in order to grow. The intensity of the attraction is proportional to the importance of the projection. The more desperately you feel you need someone, the more likely they're carrying something that belongs to you. The fourth type of person you must remove is what I call the collective unconscious denier, and this requires understanding one of Jung's most revolutionary ideas, that beneath our personal unconscious lies a deeper layer of the psyche we all share, the collective unconscious. Jung proposed that we inherit not just physical traits but psychological structures, archetypes, that shape how we experience and interpret reality. The hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man. These aren't just characters in stories. They're patterns in the human psyche that have existed across cultures and throughout history. They manifest in our dreams, our myths, our religious experiences, and our deepest creative impulses. The collective unconscious denier is someone who lives in a state of radical psychological reductionism. For them, everything is either purely biological or purely social. Humans are nothing more than sophisticated animals driven by evolutionary impulses, or blank slates shaped entirely by conditioning. There's no mystery, no depth, no transcendent dimension to human experience. Everything can be explained, measured, and controlled. Why is this person toxic to your individuation? Because Jung understood that connecting with the collective unconscious, with something larger than your personal ego and your immediate circumstances, is essential for psychological health. When we're cut off from archetypal energies and experiences, we become shallow, anxious, and purposeless. We suffer what Jung called the neurosis of meaninglessness. The collective unconscious denier mocks or pathologizes your depth. If you have a meaningful dream, they reduce it to indigestion or random neural firing. If you feel drawn to mythology, spirituality, or symbolic practices, they dismiss it as irrational or primitive thinking. If you describe a synchronicity, a meaningful coincidence that feels like more than chance, they ridicule you. Jung himself faced this his entire career. His former mentor, Sigmund Freud, and many of his colleagues couldn't accept that the psyche might contain anything beyond personal trauma and sexual impulses. They saw Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious, archetypes, and spirituality as a betrayal of scientific materialism. But Jung understood something crucial. The reductive, purely materialistic view of human nature doesn't explain the depth of human suffering or the heights of human achievement. These deniers operate from what Jung called a nothing but philosophy. A cathedral is nothing but stone and economics. Love is nothing but neurochemistry and evolutionary strategy. Art is nothing but sublimated sexual energy. This perspective isn't just intellectually bankrupt, it's psychologically deadening. When you're surrounded by collective unconscious deniers, you begin to doubt your own deeper experiences. That numinous moment you had in nature becomes just endorphins. That sense of calling you feel toward a particular path becomes just social conditioning. The symbolic richness of your inner life gets flattened into crude mechanisms. Jung believed that modern people suffer specifically because we've lost connection to the symbolic and archetypal dimensions of existence. We've demythologized the world, and now wonder why it feels meaningless. The collective unconscious denier reinforces this disconnection, actively preventing you from accessing the psychological and spiritual resources you need for wholeness. Moreover, these individuals often display what Jung called unconscious inflation. They're so identified with rationality and consciousness that they've become possessed by the very unconscious they deny. They become rigid, dogmatic, and strangely emotional about their purely rational worldview. They've repressed the symbolic, and it returns as fundamentalism, fundamentalist materialism. You can identify the collective unconscious denier through their reductionism and their hostility toward depth. They're uncomfortable with ambiguity, mystery, and paradox. They demand everything fit into their narrow explanatory framework. When you try to discuss your inner life, your struggles with meaning, or your sense that life contains dimensions beyond the purely material, they become dismissive or even hostile. Jung wrote, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." He understood that psychological truth often exists in paradox and symbol, not in linear logic. The collective unconscious denier cannot tolerate this, and will, consciously or unconsciously, try to flatten your experience to match their impoverished worldview. Removing these people from your life creates space for you to explore the full depth of your psyche. It allows you to take your dreams seriously, to find meaning in synchronicities, to engage with mythology and symbol as psychological truths rather than primitive superstitions. It permits you to be a whole human being rather than the truncated version that fits someone else's materialistic philosophy. Jung's approach was integrative. He valued both consciousness and the unconscious, both reason and intuition, both science and spirituality. The collective unconscious denier represents a one-sided extreme that, ironically, is itself deeply unconscious. For your individuation to proceed, you need to be surrounded by people who can hold complexity and depth, not those who reduce everything to their preferred simplification. The fifth and perhaps most dangerous type of person you must remove from your life is the individuation saboteur. This person is toxic precisely because they've intuited what you're trying to do, become your authentic self, and they are consciously or unconsciously committed to preventing it. Jung understood that individuation is threatening to the collective. When you become who you truly are, you stop being who others need you to be. You stop fitting into assigned roles, meeting unconscious expectations, or serving as a container for others' projections. Your growth destabilizes the system you're part of, whether that's a family, a social group, or a broader community. The individuation saboteur has a stake in keeping you unindividuated. Sometimes this is obvious. They benefit directly from your staying small, confused, or dependent. A controlling parent who sabotages your independence. An insecure partner who undermines your confidence. A competitive friend who belittles your achievements. These people need you to remain less than you could be because your fullness threatens their position or self-concept. But often, the sabotage is more subtle and more insidious. The individuation saboteur might genuinely believe they have your best interests at heart. They might use the language of concern, protection, or realism. "I just don't want you to get hurt. You need to be practical. You're being selfish by focusing on yourself. Who do you think you are?" That last phrase is particularly revealing. Jung believed that answering, "Who am I?" is the fundamental question of individuation. The individuation saboteur responds to this question with shame and deflation. They suggest that seeking to know yourself is arrogant, that becoming who you truly are is somehow an act of hubris rather than an act of psychological necessity. These saboteurs employ several strategies. They might use guilt, suggesting that your growth hurts others or betrays relationships. After all I've done for you, this is how you repay me? They might use fear, warning of all the dangers that await if you step outside your assigned box. The world will chew you up and spit you out. They might use comparison, holding up others who stayed in their lane as virtuous examples while implying you're defective for wanting something different. Jung recognized that the individuation process often requires what he called the separation of the world parents, a psychological separation from parental and collective authorities so you can discover your own authority. The individuation saboteur is anyone who refuses to allow this separation or who punishes you when you attempt it. What makes these people particularly difficult to identify and remove is that they often love you, or at least they love the version of you that serves their needs. They might have genuine care for you within the limits of their own psychological capacity, but their care is conditional on your compliance. The moment you begin truly individuating, their support transforms into sabotage. You can recognize the individuation saboteur through the patterns that emerge when you make moves toward authentic growth. When you set boundaries, they violate them. When you discover something about yourself, they dismiss or reinterpret it. When you achieve something meaningful, they downplay it or shift focus to what you haven't achieved. When you need support for your growth, they're mysteriously unavailable. But when you're struggling or regressing, they're suddenly very present and helpful. This last point is crucial. The individuation saboteur is often most supportive when you're at your weakest, because your weakness confirms their narrative about you and maintains the relational status quo. Your strength, your clarity, your growth, these threaten them. Jung wrote about the treasure hard to attain, the self that lies at the end of the individuation journey. But he also knew that this treasure is guarded by dragons, both internal and external. The individuation saboteur is one of those external dragons. They position themselves between you and your potential, and they will not move aside willingly. Removing these people requires tremendous courage, because they're often the ones closest to you. They might be family members, long-term friends, or romantic partners. But Jung was clear. Individuation is not optional if you want to live authentically. It's the central task of the second half of life, and it requires that you prioritize your psychological development over others' comfort with your assigned role. This doesn't mean you become cruel or thoughtless. Jung advocated for consciousness, not revenge. But it does mean you recognize that you cannot become who you are meant to be while surrounded by people who are invested in keeping you who they need you to be. The individuation saboteur will frame your necessary separation as abandonment, your growth as betrayal, your authenticity as selfishness. They will not understand that what you're doing is not against them, but for yourself. They cannot understand this, because understanding would require their own individuation work, which they've refused to do. In removing these people, you're not just creating space in your external life. You're making a statement to your own unconscious that you're committed to becoming real. You're declaring that your authentic self matters more than your approved persona, that your truth matters more than their comfort, that your individuation matters more than their need for you to remain static. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he also understood that this privilege comes with a price. The price is often paid in relationships that cannot accommodate your growth. The 5 types of people we've discussed, the shadow projector, the persona enforcer, the anima/animus possessor, the collective unconscious denier, and the individuation saboteur, all represent obstacles to your becoming. They keep you unconscious, fragmented, and false. Not necessarily because they're evil, but because their own psychological states require you to remain less than whole. Removing these people from your life isn't about judgment or revenge. It's about recognizing that you have one life, one psyche, one opportunity to become who you truly are. Jung believed that failing to individuate wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was a cosmic one. When you don't become who you're meant to be, something unique and necessary is lost from the world. The individuation process is already difficult enough. It requires confronting your shadow, integrating your unlived potential, suffering through crises of meaning, and ultimately discovering your authentic self beneath all the layers of conditioning and projection. You cannot do this work while carrying other people's projections, conforming to their enforced personas, or tolerating their active sabotage. Jung's psychology is ultimately optimistic. He believed that within each person lies the potential for wholeness, that the psyche naturally moves toward integration and authenticity if we don't block it. But we must be willing to remove the obstacles, both internal and external. As you reflect on your own life and relationships, ask yourself, who supports my becoming? Who celebrates my growth and authenticity? And who, despite perhaps loving me in their limited way, cannot tolerate me being fully myself? The answers to these questions will guide you toward the difficult but necessary work of creating a life that supports your individuation rather than preventing it. Jung's final message was one of individual responsibility. No one can individuate for you. No one can become you except you. And while the journey requires solitude and often separation from those who would keep you small, it leads to something invaluable, a life that is genuinely your own. Thank you for watching. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe. And remember, the journey to becoming who you are begins with the courage to stop being who you're not.